History and Culture podcasts are a production of PCN, a nonprofit television network. Listeners like you make our programming possible. To learn more about PCN's mission and to support PCN with a donation, visit pcntv.com. This link and others can be found in our show notes. We appreciate your support.
Welcome to PCN's History and Culture podcast. I'm Phil Beckman. This podcast series features interviews exploring Pennsylvania's rich history from the colonial era to industrialization, the Gettysburg Campaign to sports history, and from art to politics and more.
We're joined by Wagner, an agricultural teacher at Danville High School. In the 1800s, it was common to use rivers to transport logs. If you're standing on the bank of the river, what would it have looked like to see the river filled with all of these logs and these rafts?
Oh my goodness. Well, I'm going to comment on the Susquehanna River because that's where I live. And some of the firsthand accounts from the 1830s that I've referenced before talk about literally thousands of rafts per day going by Danville up here on the north branch of the Susquehanna River in the springtime. So you'd have the river coming up from the snow melting, and you'd have these woodsmen coming down with their log rafts. It would have been a one-way traffic jam. I have often told folks it's like Penn State football traffic is probably the closest thing you and I can compare it to, because it would have just been a flurry of activity and everyone's on the river trying to go to the same place, which is Lancaster County, where they could sell their logs.
Where in Pennsylvania was the logging industry centered?
So the answer to that's going to be different depending on the different time periods. But in general, what started happening in the late 1700s is people in the southern markets. So we're talking about the barn builders and the ship builders on the lower Susquehanna River, but for that matter, the lower Delaware River as well. They no longer had domestic pine to choose from in their own backyards. So it started creating a cash economy where people up here in the mountains, if you will, had plenty of white pine, and word spread quickly like, hey, if you can get your white pine logs to the ship builders and the barn builders down in southern Pennsylvania, they'll pay you cash for this thing that we otherwise consider a weed. And so the logging kind of proceeded in patches. You started seeing the areas of pine closest to the river exploited first, but it was a well over a century long process, and it wasn't just a one location answer to your question. It really was watershed wide, wherever the pine was and wherever the water was to transport it.
Were there other trees that were used other than the white pine?
Absolutely. White pine was by far the preferred for ship building and barn building. It had all kinds of great properties. It was very strong, yet low enough in density that it could float, so that made transportation possible. Beautiful to work with. I met an old-time woodworker once told me he referred to white pine as the Lord's wood, meaning it's such a pleasure to work with. It's the perfect wood. And then he added the devil-made hemlock, and what he was referring to is hemlock is an example of a tree that certainly has its modern day uses, but in the old days was not preferred. It was just not the same grain as our white pine. There are accounts too of some of the hardwoods being mixed in. So you'd have an occasional cherry log or black walnut log or oak log mixed into a raft of white pine. But without the white pine, you couldn't float the other logs. But it was predominantly a white pine industry.
Where did Pennsylvania's loggers come from?
Well, they were a mix. Many of them weren't loggers, if you will. Many of them were simply farmers. And this was something that rural people could do to make money, just like if they were trapping for furs to sell, just like if they had a still and they were making distilled spirits. It was just part of life on the farm. In fact, that word logger really doesn't show up till closer to the Civil War. It was a concept that came about later, this concept of, oh, you could just cut trees full time for a living. Before that, America got its lumber, its wood from farmers, these people that were up in the watershed. You know, they're a few miles off the river. They would cut the white pine in the winter months when farmers don't have as much field work to be doing. And they would use their farm animals, their oxen, their mules, their horses to skid the logs down to the edge of the creeks or rivers. And then from there, they'd raft them down the Susquehanna or the Delaware River. There was certainly some in Western Pennsylvania on the Allegheny and the Ohio. So just about all of Pennsylvania's major rivers had rafting.
Let's talk about the rafts themselves. How were they made?
The rafts that were made here in Pennsylvania really were Yankee ingenuity. And what I mean by that is there was rafting in Europe. There's been rafting in Africa, rafting in Asia, like all the other continents where people come from and have trees. Rafting is a traditional way of getting logs to market. However, here in Pennsylvania, and I won't say just Pennsylvania, I'll simply say from Pennsylvania, New York into New England, some of the logs they were dealing with were absolutely enormous, and they were bigger than what my ancestors coming from Europe were used to. And so they had to come up with a means for putting the log rafts together using just what they had in the forest. And the method they used here on the Susquehanna River is pretty creative, and you won't see it elsewhere in the world. They would put all the logs next to each other in the river, and then they would put a what's called lash pole, just a few inches in diameter pole, often hickory, across the end of the logs. And then they would drill a hole on either side of that lash pole, about an inch, inch and a half. You would then take a piece of green white oak, typically. When I say green, I mean it's still sappy wood, sappy and living. And you'd cut a little strip of white oak, and then you'd make like a horseshoe-shaped bow. And then you'd put that up and over the lash pole, down inside the holes, and then you'd pound an ash peg down in those holes. When a little bit of river water got on that, it would swell that ash tight, and that strap that you made of white oak would hold tight. And now you've held everything together with nothing but wood. No, you didn't need rope, you didn't need iron, you didn't need anything like that. You'd float to market, and then all you had to do was take an axe and cut that white oak bow, and the log was free. So that's the method they came up with. Some people say it originated in Maine, some say New York, some say Pennsylvania. I'll again just say this general region is where you started to see it show up.
Did all the rafts look the same, or were there different types?
There really were two broad categories of log rafts. And some, they would bring the logs out of the forest and assemble a log raft with that raw log. So can you picture that? Just round logs next to each other. But in some cases, people took a tool called a broadaxe. And while the tree was still on the forest floor, once they cut the tree down, they would square it crudely with a broadaxe. And that then allowed you to bring that squared log out of the woods and put that in the river. And if you start putting square log against square log against square log, you're maximizing the volume of lumber that you're eventually going to get downriver in that raft. If you have round log next to round log, we have what's called slab wood nowadays. You know, the slabs are the sides of the logs that for the most part don't have commercial value. So it was all a matter of, are you going to spend the trouble with a broadaxe to square your logs in the forest, or are you just going to send the round logs down and get maybe a few less pennies on the dollar? That was the decision that they had to make.
How did they steer the rafts while in the river?
So the rafts only traveled as fast as the river was moving, right? This isn't like a canoe where you're going to paddle faster or slow down. So you're moving as fast as the river's going. The way they would steer is they had a sweep at the front and a sweep at the back. And a sweep was just like a giant oar. I mean, to give your viewers an idea how giant we're talking here, it typically took two men to operate one sweep. And so if you can kind of picture a long sweep like this with a paddle at the end and two men at this end, and they're going to like lift it up out of the water and then sweep, lift it out of the water and sweep. And that's how they're going to steer the front of the raft the direction they want it to go. And then there needs to be a sweep on the back too. You have to keep the front and the back in line. What you did not want happening is have that raft start to get cockeyed in the stream or turn sideways. And it did happen. There are cases where that would happen, but it usually ended badly.
I was going to say, what would happen if like a raft got broken apart for whatever reason? What would they do?
I'm thinking right now of a well-documented family of woodsmen from Sullivan County, I believe, and they were rafting down Loyalsock Creek, which, by the way, is hard to believe because most of us drive by Loyalsock Creek today and you think, how could I even get a canoe down there in most of the year? But during a spring flood, they would raft it. And there's a documented case from the 1800s where the flood finally happened, the Loyalsock Creek came up, and everybody had their raft ready to go. So they all start going down the Loyalsock River at the same time. And a rookie who had no experience somehow got his raft turned sideways in the stream. Well, down come a few dozen of his neighbors on their log rafts. And let me remind you too, these rafts are in many cases over 100 feet long. 20 to 30 feet wide. This is several tons of white pine moving at the speed of the floodwater. So in some cases, 10 or 15 miles an hour. So they came down and they crashed into this guy. Um, Fists were being thrown at each other. There's fist fights going on. And finally, what they did in his case was, without even asking him, they just took out their axes and they chopped his raft to pieces to break up the log jam and free the creek again. They didn't say, hey, is this okay with you? They just did it. So
How did the weather and the changing seasons impact the rafting down the river?
amazingly, it didn't impact them. Like I look at this from a modern point of view, and I think they went out there when there was still snow on the ground, when there was still ice in the water, and they're in many cases ankle deep or worse in the water. And you really don't come across too many accounts of any complaints. These people that did it for a lifetime and then later were interviewed, they didn't go on about, oh, and it was terribly cold. They were tough men. And I'll say, and women too. There are cases where a lot of times the family would go down together, and the mom of the family would be on board, often with the cooking duty on board the raft. They'd have a fire right on the raft, and they'd cook right there. So men and women did it, but predominantly this was a man's job. And you don't see too many documented cases of them complaining, even though they're in freezing cold temperatures. Many died, many fell in, and if they didn't drown instantly, many of them got hypothermia. So I don't know that we'll ever have good numbers or good data on how many, but it was certainly a significant risk.
How long was the actual journey itself?
One of the answers to that question comes from a great book called Susquehanna River of Dreams by Suzanne Stranahan. Really great section in that book on the raftsmen. And by the way, it's hard to find books on the rafts. A lot of stuff out there on Pennsylvania logging history, but not a whole lot on rafting. And in her book, as I recall, she talked about in the 1790s, a family that was into rafting. They were up on the New York, Pennsylvania border in New York State, and they jumped on a log raft, brought it down the north branch of the Susquehanna River, and then it joins the main branch of the Susquehanna there at Sunbury. And they rode it all the way to, I believe in her book, it just says the Tidewater. So to me, that means almost to the Maryland border. And then they walked home. And as I recall, her book said the entire journey took 9 days. Now, of that, how many days were they rafting and how many days were they walking? I don't know, but I'll hypothesize that I bet if they were doing it when the river is high and really moving, I bet it only took them 3 or 4 days to raft it and then approximately a week to walk home. And if they were like most families, when they got home, they did it again. In many cases, these families had enough logs piled that they could do several rafts in a season. And it wasn't like anyone was getting rich, but it was a source of income on farm. Keep in mind in this time period you and I are discussing, people didn't make a whole lot of money in farming. You made food. So to make actual cash, you needed a cash crop. I mentioned earlier furs. I mentioned earlier whiskey, or if you had a still, you could make distilled spirits. But white pine was one of the few things these farmers could export and it would still keep. So by the time they got to market, they could cash it in for gold. If it's the 1830s, how are you going to get fresh milk to market? You aren't. So there wasn't a lot of cash in those crops they were growing. There was food, and they would barter with their neighbors, and they would feed the pastor and feed the school teacher. But when it came to actually making money, white pine was one of the few ways they could do that.
Now, you mentioned that some of the rafts would go to Lancaster, one of them went to Maryland. Where else would these rafts be headed?
Ultimately, they're going to where the market is. So the best way to answer that question is, where were they building ships, and where was the demand for homes and barns and factories? And so here on the north branch of the Susquehanna River, actually upstream from Danville, you hit the Wyoming Valley. Okay. And once the anthracite coal boom was in full swing, a tremendous amount of lumber was needed to build those breakers and build the infrastructure for the mines. And so in places like that, I'm sure you'd have raftsmen coming down river. And in some cases, there'd be a lumber buyer right there on the banks of the river saying, if you stop here, we'll pay you top dollar for your logs. They weren't necessarily trying to go to Maryland. They were just trying to sell their logs. So I'm going to put myself in their shoes and say, if I could save myself a few days of rafting and a lot of walking, and someone's going to pay me the same price, I'll sell mine in Wilkes-Barre gladly. Nanacoke gladly. And if not, they'd keep going down the river. Here in Danville, we're famous here in Danville for making the first T-rail using anthracite coal in world history, for that matter. But certainly in American history, we were the first ones to make the T-rail. And the T-rail is the railroad track, the thing that trains can run on. So this is the famous part of Danville, this T-rail. Well, the very first T-rail we ever made, we didn't have a railroad to ship it out on, and the canal was frozen. So the way we shipped our very first T-rails in 1845 here in Danville, on the log rafts that were coming by the river. So again, these guys are coming down the river. The iron company stopped a few of the pilots and said, "Hey, we'll pay you a couple bucks to put a couple iron T-rails on your raft and take that to market." So it was a way to make money, and these guys were resourceful. If they could take on extra cargo, they would. I also think about on the West Branch of the Susquehanna River, they had during the Civil War, they put out a poster that said, if you want to enlist, if you want to volunteer for the Union, you meet in, I believe they told everybody, meet in Driftwood. And hundreds of men showed up. The problem was there was no railroad to Driftwood yet. So they've got a couple hundred recruits. The problem was the railroad was just about at Renova at that point. So they had to figure out a way to get these several hundred men and horses, because there were men that showed up to be officers with horses. How do you get them downriver, excuse me, to Renova? And the answer is they did it on log rafts. They flagged down a couple of these log rafts coming by. They loaded a bunch of men on each boat or on each raft and said, head on down the river. And they even put on the officers' horses. Wouldn't that have been a scene? And they got down to closer to Renova and got on a train, and off to the Civil War they went. But it wasn't just about logs. It was sometimes transporting other things as well.
What would happen once the rafts reached their destination? Did the people just go back to where they were coming from?
In most cases, once they would reach, I'm going to speak as a Susquehannan here, because here on the Susquehanna River, our market was Marietta, Lancaster County. That's where most of them were headed. That's where the best money was. And so many of them would get to Marietta, and it would be a bit like a livestock auction. You'd have log buyers right there on the banks of the river, and it's a little bit of an auction, a little bit of a yard sale. And there's all kinds of businesses, buying and selling going. And if you'd find a buyer for your logs, I'll give you a rough number. I'm going to say approximately $100 for much of the 1800s for a log raft. $100 is a one-size-fits-all answer. Ish. There were good years and bad years, and there were other examples of more money and less money, but I want to give your viewers just an approximation. So $100. That's now got to split usually 5 ways, because there was usually a pilot and then 2 men on the sweep at the front and 2 men on the sweep in the back. It was usually a family enterprise. So you can imagine it was probably like granddad, dad and a son, and maybe a son and a son-in-law. So it's a family operation. If granddad's feeling really generous, then he's going to split it 5 ways, and you get $20. Again, no one's getting rich here, but it's money, it's income. But to answer your question of now, what did they do? You walked home, and in some cases you never made it home, because the folks on the banks of the river, they knew what was going on. There's thousands of these rafts going down the river. There's millions of dollars walking upriver. They very quickly patterned these guys out. And so sadly, there are good documented cases of these guys being preyed upon. They'd stop in a tavern for dinner or a drink in any river town. It could be Liverpool, it could be Sunbury, it could be Milton, Lewisburg, Danville, Bloomsburg, and they'd pick these guys out. You could see them because they've got their metal corks on the bottom of their boots, meaning they walk on logs and floating logs. So everything about their appearance gives them away. Oh, you're a woodsman. Oh, and you're walking. If you're walking, that means you sold your logs. And so sadly, they'd sucker these guys left and right and try and lure them around back and mug them, in some cases take their lives.
What were the logs being used for?
Much of the white pine that was harvested in the 1800s was for framing ships that navigated the ocean. It was for framing barns. It was for building houses. I recently came across a document talking about how the White House was actually framed. The White House in Washington, D.C. was framed out of white pine from Pennsylvania. Now, I haven't quite figured out how they got from there to there, but the point is our white pine was really superior quality stuff coming out of the Appalachian Mountains here in this part of Pennsylvania and New York. And shipbuilders paid a premium for it. Where the real money was if you had a really nice specimen of white pine, it could be used for the spar or the mast on a ship, right? So if you can picture your Pirates of the Caribbean movies, the ship itself would have cost a lot of money to make. But if you don't have the right piece of wood for a mast, to me, it's like an engine for a truck, right? The engine might be arguably the most important part. So if you had some really primo white pine, that was big money if you could get that to the shipbuilders. And some people made a lot of money doing that. That was not terribly common though. Again, you had to have the really premier stand of white pine to do that. In the colonial time, the British Crown actually sent royal foresters through Pennsylvania, through the forest, and they picked out these perfect specimens of white pine and actually wood burned the royal insignia on the bark of the tree. And what that meant to the colonists was hands off. Okay, this belongs to the king. This belongs to the Royal Navy. And I'm told that when the revolution finally broke out, some of those trees were the first ones to be cut down because the colonists knew about them. I mean, it was just like, easy money standing right there, but nobody would touch it when it was the king's. But once the war broke out, people were glad to cash in on that timber.
How long does this idea of log rafting in Pennsylvania last?
The answer is different for different rivers. So here on the Susquehanna River, really things declined severely by the 1880s for a lot of reasons. But in short, by the 1880s, it was really in decline here on the Susquehanna River. But to my east on the Delaware River, they still had a rafting industry into the early 20s. There's some really nice books on that. There's one called Holt to Other Way, which is kind of slang that the rafters would use, Holt to Other Way. And it was what a captain would say when he wanted to sweep to the other side of the river. But that book, which I believe has been reprinted by the Easton Historical Society, I believe, has some really nice documentation of, this is after World War I, and they're still rafting on the eastern side of the state on the Delaware. The Allegheny River and Ohio still had some coming down about that time period, but really by the 1920s, it was all over really, and for a combination of reasons. I mean, and one is there was no white pine left. I mean, we really had harvested this forest relentlessly for almost 200 years at that point, and the easy stands were gone. In fact, the little bit of old growth forest that we have here today in the state, we have because someone had the foresight years ago to not cut it. It's not an accident. So we're lucky we can still see some of that timber today. And a lot of that has become state land. So some of my favorite places to go visit, you can go to Cook Forest is a really nice place where you can see some virgin pine. I really like Hammersley, which is up in the Potter, Clinton County area in the border country there. Tall timbers. They're out there. Ricketts Glen is a neat one, although that's mostly hemlock. So some of your viewers might be familiar with some of those state parks. They're out there, but they're few and far between.
How is the history of log rafting in Pennsylvania remembered today?
There's a lot of small community festivals up and down the Susquehanna River that celebrate our heritage on the river. And it's hit and miss whether or not you see rafting celebrated in there. We have such a rich history in Pennsylvania. And so I don't fault anyone for this, because when you go to celebrate your history, it's like, where do you start and stop? And so to me, it falls on the responsibility of all of us as Pennsylvanians. If you're involved in education, if you're involved in working with young people, it's our responsibility to make sure we're telling the story. We can't just sit back and say, gee, someone else should be doing this. It's our responsibility. So as a school teacher, I'm predominantly an agriculture teacher, but any chance I get, I try to include the story of rafting on the Susquehanna River in my classroom lessons. Because as my Penn State professor, Richard Pauling, used to say, if we don't know where we come from, we don't know who we are, and we don't know where we're going. And I really think that's a powerful way to see the value of education. We have to make sure we are telling our story ourselves and keeping this story alive.
Now, in 2003, a group of Pennsylvanians actually built a raft named the Montour. How did that go?
Was it that long ago? Yeah, my friends and I got together and said, we really ought to build a full-size log raft like would have been on the river in the 1800s. And a group of community-minded folks got together, and it was just such a great chance for people to just come together and give. Everybody was donating things to it. So welcome to school. So people were just donating to the cause. So we had the logs were donated, the land where we built it donated. A local farmer gave his tractor for a month or two to help us push the logs in. And we needed a really powerful drill to drill holes and That was all donated. It was great. So we came down there, we put in close to Bloomsburg, Catawissa, and we rafted to Danville and then on to Sunbury. And then we couldn't go any further because there's a structure there in the river called the Fiber Dam or the Bower Dam, and we couldn't go over that safely. But it was really a neat experience to get a sense of what it's like to stand on a raft of logs coming down the river. It's an experience I'll cherish the rest of my life.
And why do you personally think it's important to remember this piece of Pennsylvania's history?
I love our natural resources. However, I want to go one step further and say that I like to remember the human connection to our natural resources. So the Susquehanna River is such a treasure, but it's a treasure to humans, right? That's kind of the angle I'm coming from here. And so I like to make sure we are reminded of how our natural resources have shaped us as a people and benefited us as a people. And the Susquehanna River has continued to just be the life source of the people of this valley for thousands of years. And so to me, the story of log rafting is just one more important chapter when remembering natural resources and how they are connected specifically to people and to our ancestors.
We've been speaking with Van Wagner, an agricultural teacher at Danville High School. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for coming back to the classroom.
Listeners like you make PCN programming possible. Full episodes of PCN's history and culture content, like the interview you just heard, are available to stream with the PCN Select app. Explore other documentary programs, event coverage, and a lot more. To learn more about PCN's mission and to support PCN with a donation, visit PCNTV.com. This link and others can be found in our show notes. We appreciate your support.